For a lot of you out there, you have trade deadlines quickly approaching in your league. So there are players that need to be bought and players that need to be sold before then to help you gear up for the fantasy playoffs. So today I have a list of 4 running backs, 2 of which to buy, 2 of which to sell before your trade deadline. So the first running back that you should be buying before your deadlines and the playoffs is Falcons running back Cordarrelle Patterson. And he's only played in 4 what I'll call complete games if you remove the game that he got hurt in. But in those 4 games, he has 2 100-yard games, 4 touchdowns, and has finished as a top 6 running back 3 times. Again, in only 4 games. Even in his first game back from injury this past week, and they were easing him back in, he still had 14 touches and scored twice. Not only is he a smash play this week against a horrible Panthers run defense, he also gets Chicago next week in week 11. And then in the fantasy playoffs, weeks 15 through 17, he gets the Saints, who he torched for 120-1 in week 1. The Ravens, who have given up 3 top 10 performances so far to Nick Chubb, Saquon Barkley, and Ramondre Stevenson, plus 7 more top 24 finishes. And then championship week, he's at home against the Arizona Cardinals, who have also given up 5 top 10 performances, like what we just saw this week from Kenneth Walker, plus Kenneth Walker again earlier this year, and then Dalvin Cook 2 weeks ago in week 8. If you're a contender in Dynasty, I'd be 100% willing to pay your late second and then maybe an extra throw-in to get Cordarrelle Patterson. In redraft, I'd be trying to flip guys like Michael Carter off of a really good game, James Conner, Leonard Fournette, and honestly, here's a really hot one for you too. Flip Josh Jacobs for Cordarrelle Patterson and like a wide receiver 2 or 3 guy, like a Keenan or Mike Williams returning from injury, Chris Godwin, Amon-Ra St. Brown, DJ Moore after down weeks. Those are the trades that I would be looking to make to go get Cordarrelle Patterson right now. My second running back to buy right now is actually DeAndre Swift. And I know DeAndre Swift, he's a bust, he sucks, he can't stay healthy, and even when he is healthy, he barely plays, blah, 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 blah. Here's what I see with DeAndre Swift. I see a player that, yes, has struggled to stay healthy over parts of each of the last 3 seasons, and a player who is currently trying to come back from one of those injuries. But I also see a player that, when healthy and playing over 40% of snaps in a game dating back to 2021, has been a top 20 running back in 75% of his games and top 10 in half of those. This season alone, he's played only 5 games and has 2 top 10 finishes, another top 20, and another top 30 as a flex player. You could have played him this past week when he was getting limited touches, and he still outscored both Packers running backs, both Bears running backs, both Commanders running backs, and was within 1 to 3 fantasy points this week of Josh Jacobs, Alvin Kamara, and Leonard Fournette. So now looking ahead for the remainder of the season, Dan Campbell's already saying that they're going to work him in more this week, and I would expect that to continue basically every week going forward for the rest of the season. So the hope here is that we basically have a fully healthy DeAndre Swift by the fantasy playoffs, whereas opponents those 3 weeks are the New York Jets, who just gave up an RB10 week to Ramondre Stevenson 2 weeks ago, primarily through receiving. Then the Carolina Panthers, who just bleed fantasy points to opposing running backs. And if you played against Joe Mixon this week, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And then championship week, Swift gets the Chicago Bears, who have given up an RB1 performance in 7 of 9 games so far. I can almost guarantee you that every Swift manager out there is super frustrated with him not being the elite running back that they thought they were getting when they drafted him. So take advantage of that frustration and go buy him on the cheap. Use the same players that I talked about with Cordarrelle Patterson, package those guys to go get DeAndre Swift. Or maybe use this next running back to trade down to DeAndre Swift and get something on top, because I'm advising selling Joe Mixon right now before the fantasy playoffs. And I know that sounds crazy after this past week that we just had where he was absolutely insane, dropped a 50 bomb on everybody, but I'm going to advise y'all to try to sell Joe Mixon before the trade deadline and the fantasy playoffs, because Mixon, while he's been very good this year, and even before this past weekend had put up 3 top 12 weeks and 3 other top 24 weeks. That's the name of the game for Joe Mixon basically throughout his entire career. He's just kind of ping-pongy all throughout the season. He's a little bit more reliant on touchdowns than I think we want to actually admit that he is. He hasn't been particularly efficient on the ground. He's averaging only 3.3 yards per carry before this past week and has only eclipsed 60 rushing yards 4 times this year. He's a good running back. He's just not great or elite, except for this past week. Obviously, absolutely over 200 yards, 5 total touchdowns, over 50 fantasy points, week winner. But I think that you should use that game and sell as high as humanly possible because his end of season performance might actually eliminate teams from playoff contention. I mean, just look at his schedule in the fantasy playoffs. He's at Tampa Bay, at New England, and then at home against Buffalo. Those teams right now are currently ranked 27th, 28th, and 29th in fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. This isn't the same Bengals team as last year that was on their way to the Super Bowl. They could lose, honestly, all 3 of these games, which means negative game scripts for running the ball. Jamar Chase also is expected to come back in a couple of weeks, so less offensive focus on Joe Mixon. Those are just matchups that I really don't want to take my borderline fantasy RB1 into. I would honestly even be nervous if I had Christian McCaffrey or Derrick Henry with that schedule, and that's CMC and Derrick Henry, not Joe Mixon. So take advantage of the week that you just got from Joe Mixon. Tell him thank you for winning you your week, but it's time to let go and flip him for maybe a wide receiver 1 plus Cordarrelle Patterson or DeAndre Swift, maybe Mark Andrews plus Cordarrelle Patterson or DeAndre Swift. Aim as high as you can and see what comes back to you. And the second running back I would advise selling before the playoffs is someone I've already mentioned before in this video as well, and that's Josh Jacobs. Like Mixon, Jacobs has also been really ping-pongy this season. He had that 3-week stretch around his bye week where he had 3 straight top 3 finishes, but outside of those 3 weeks, he hasn't cracked the top 15 once this season, including 2 weeks outside the top 40. And again, also very similar to Joe Mixon, Jacobs' playoff schedule is pretty rough with the New England Patriots in week 15, Pittsburgh in week 16, and the Niners in championship week. Those are 3 bottom 10 defenses against running backs right now, including the Niners being the toughest defense against opposing running backs. Jacobs also gets the Rams the week before the playoffs, who are also top 10 currently against running backs. So I just really don't want to be going into the playoffs with Jacobs as my RB2, let alone my RB1 if some of y'all actually have him there. He won't kill you by any means, but I don't think he's necessarily helping you either if he only scores 10 to 12 points if he's not getting into the end zone against defenses who are really hard to get into the end zone against. I think like Mixon, you can just dangle Josh Jacobs out there to your league. Someone's going to remember that he was that dude who torched people 3 weeks in a row, and then hopefully pay that kind of price for him in order to get him. Again, maybe if you can turn Josh Jacobs into Patterson plus, DeAndre Swift plus, you'll be setting yourself up nicely for a championship run. And if you haven't watched it yet, you can check out this same video, but for wide receivers to buy and sell before the trade deadline right up here.